you for coming. I know it's a busy day. Everyone's got busy things that are going on, so I appreciate you taking your time to come here and be with us today. My name is Thomas Sellers, and I'm currently serving as the president of the Graduate Student Association. And this panel is brought to you by the Office of the Graduate School, who has worked very hard. Dr. Coates and Dean DeGramo both have worked very hard to make this possible. But before we get started, I want to take a minute to introduce our panelists. The first is Dr. DeGramo, who is the Dean of the Graduate School and Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs. He's a professor of wildlife fisheries and aquaculture and a Giles Distinguished Professor. We also have Dr. Allison Pearson, who is a professor of Management and Information Systems. She's also a Giles Distinguished Professor. We have Dr. Lori Bruce, who is an Associate Dean and Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering and a Giles Distinguished Professor. We have Dr. Keith Coble, who is a Professor of Agricultural Economics and also a Giles Distinguished Professor. And Dr. Trisha Phillips, who is an Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religion. And like we said, we're glad that you're here today. We're going to have a conversation about ethics in research, and ethics within academics. We have several different questions that our panelists will talk through and provide examples for, hopefully, and give some good insight on their expertise in their specific fields in which they work. So to start off, I'm going to read the first question, and then we'll you can chime in as you feel comfortable, and if not, we'll just go down the road when we need to hit on different topics. So the first question is, do any of you have personal experience, either as a student or a principal investigator, when someone in your lab or research group attempted or committed research misconduct? How was it handled, and what was the outcome?
I'll start. I have had experience with a graduate student who did commit research misconduct. As Thomas had mentioned, I'm in the Department of Wildlife Fisheries and Aquaculture, and I was doing some research with crayfish, crawfish, and I had a graduate student, and I was concerned that she might not have been working on weekends, which was very important in terms of emptying out traps and collecting animals and all that. And so I asked my research associate during the long weekend of July 4th to put some stones in the traps and to see whether the stones were there when he checked them again on the following Monday after the long weekend. And of course they were there. And when I got the data from the graduate student, there was also data that had been collected during those days. So obviously, like any kind of ethics violation, I think the foundation is a breach of trust, and in this case, a breach of trust by the graduate student. And of course, then I began to question whether any of the data was valid, or maybe even part of it was valid. So obviously, I asked the student to come in, talk to the student, and said, is this what you did this weekend? These are the data that you collected and all that? And then she told me yes, that was the data that she had collected. And so therefore I confronted her with what had happened, what we had done. And then of course she had said that yes, she had committed that violation, if you will. My response was pretty rapid, because obviously I have commitments to a research grant, to a granting agency and all that. Again, I questioned how much of the data that she had collected before was valid, and I had only one recourse as far as I'm concerned, was to terminate her as a graduate assistant. So she was no longer working for me as a graduate student, and it took place within 24 hours.
I'll go next. Fortunately, most of my stories occurred in other institutions far, far away from here. I received my PhD from Texas A&M. Spent a great deal of time collecting data, building a fairly unique data set. I addressed a couple of issues in my dissertation with that data set, and then went on to my first job in my career. Another graduate student working for my lead advisor followed me on agreement that that student was going to use the same data set, there were additional variables that we had not analyzed. So they were going to address those issues with the data set. The student did the research for the dissertation. I was gone, but under the supervision of my major advisor. Completed the degree. The dissertation was accepted by the library. They received their diploma and they went home. Paper was written out of that dissertation, was submitted to a journal. Everything I thought looked good. Everything was legitimate. A reviewer asked for revisions of the paper. We got a very positive first round review. My major advisor had the data, had the model, attempted to make some corrections and began to notice some anomalies. It was not a good day when he called me up and said, "Keith, do you have the original data set? Will you send it to me?" The two of us went through that data set, 350 observations. This individual had taken the original data, modified certain variables to make sure that their econometric estimation was statistically significant. That individual, so we said, what were we going to do? And it fell upon my major advisor, but he was sufficiently dedicated to this, that diploma, that PhD diploma was revoked. It's a lot of trouble to revoke a diploma, but it can be done. And we went through the process of having that done. And so that individual went home, had a job based on them having a PhD and lost that job. So that's my story. What is my story?
Dr. Pearson, real quick, so I can interject, there were several people that came in once we had gotten started with the question. So we're talking about personal experiences that the panel has had either as a student or supervising research as a principal investigator when someone in the lab or doing the research has attempted or committed research misconduct. So that's the question that's on the table right now that we're discussing.
Unfortunately, like my colleagues, I've seen those cases of ethical and research ethics violations that are grievous, that they're very, very serious. When I was at another institution, I had a student who turned out she fabricated a great deal of data. And she'd done it through social sciences, since we use a lot of survey data, and she'd done that through, she completed the surveys, or a good portion of them. Unfortunately, at the time we were using a survey system that was written by our university, and we could literally see almost everything that went on, and we could even authenticate the IP addresses that had generated the data and the amount of time lapse between them. And she was dismissed from the program. And she was very far along in her PhD at the time. It was considered quite serious. And then just today, not dealing with a student, I came over today. I was dealing with an issue as a journal editor with a possible case of plagiarism, a very serious case of plagiarism on a manuscript that's been accepted at this journal that we are about to deal with the authors and say, no, it is not, and we'll be reporting to your institution that you violated the journal's policies of ethics. And, it's serious business.
It is, yeah. I don't have any graduate students that I supervise, so I haven't shared any of these experiences firsthand, but I do get a lot of people who come to me with questions about what to do with their graduate students because they're encountering problems like this, or sometimes even worse. And I don't know that any of those stories top the ones that you guys have just given, but I want to take a moment to highlight some of the important features of the stories that you guys are sharing. And I went to the opening ceremony of this Integrity Week, which was back Monday night, and our athletic director, Scott Strickland, gave the opening address. And I wanted to hear what he was going to say about integrity. I just thought it would be interesting, so I went and he stood up there and he talked about how important it was, and the way that he justified its importance is he said, if you lack integrity, if you violate integrity and other people's trust, it's going to end up badly for you, right? right? And he had a couple examples of that in his own work, and in every story you guys have told, it ends up very badly for the graduate student who committed research misconduct. And Scott Strickland, who is used to, as he says, living in a glass house, right? And instructs everyone who's associated with him, whether it's his staff or the students he oversees. He said, you need to realize you're living in a glass house, and you won't get away with it, right? You know, you may get away with it once or twice, but that will embolden you, and you will go even farther, and eventually you won't get away with it. What I want to say right now is that it'll end up badly for you is only half of the problem. The way these stories were told was indeed how badly it ended up for the graduate student. But research these days, so much of it is collaborative, and so much of it is done in a team, that when one person on a team engages in misconduct, it sets everybody on that team back, oftentimes years, right? How much data did you have to throw out, Dr.
It was
Brownell?
about a year and a half.
Yeah, and that was
The funding agency.
I'm going to guess that you're not independently wealthy, that you weren't funding this research yourself. No, right? I mean, so that was a year and a half worth of work that was paid for by other people's money, right? And that's a pretty significant social consequence, right? How many years was your team set back when you realized you couldn't trust the data that you had?
Oh, with our study?
Yeah.
We just threw it away. I mean, it was.
I mean, so that was years of work down the drain.
That's right.
Not only for that graduate student, but for everyone else who was involved and had contributed a significant amount of time to the product.
You know, I was early in my career. I really needed to publish.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is a temptation, but no, we can't do it.
Yeah. So it will end up badly sooner or later, but that's only half of the problem. The other half of the problem is the harm that it causes with the collateral damage that it has on others.
Well, I have, unfortunately, several stories I could tell, but I chose to talk about one that I encountered as a grad student. And so when I was a graduate student, you know, back in the bad old days when you literally had to go into the annals of the library and pull dissertations off of the shelf, and I went home with stacks of dissertations and journals. And I was at a stage in my PhD that I was ready to really start putting my dissertation together. I had done a lot of experimental work, and I was really starting to write. And I, like many grad students, didn't have a good understanding of what a dissertation looks like. So I went and just pulled dissertations off of the shelf in my general topic area in hopes of looking at how did they organize it, how was the flow of the writing, where did they put methodologies versus results, just in the document itself. And as I was going through several dissertations, I found 3 that were amazingly similar with the same advisor. And I would look, and the intro chapter had different titles, different intro chapters, and then whole chapters were the same. So it wasn't, okay, it was a general topic area, and you could tell these were students from the same group. It was complete replication of pages and pages and pages of text. And I sat on those dissertations for probably a week, worried, what would this do to me? Because this faculty member was in my department. And I really was in this ethical dilemma of, do I just put them back on the shelf, or do I speak up? And after about a week of sitting on those dissertations, I went to my major professor and explained to him what I had found, and asked him to go with me to meet with the dean of the graduate school. And he, of course, did, and he got reported. And my advisor actually went a step further and kind of filed an official complaint, so that the official complaint came from him and not me. He was also concerned about repercussions to me as a graduate student. And 2 of those 3 PhDs had their PhDs taken back. And they had been graduated 7-8 years. And so their PhDs were revoked. And I never really knew what happened to that faculty member. It was a tenured faculty member, pretty senior. And I never really knew exactly what all happened because those were kind of personnel matters, and I wasn't privy, and I wasn't going to go poke a stick. I felt like I had reported it, I did what I could do as a graduate student, and then I tried to let it go and move on.
I think the panel has done an excellent job of explaining some examples of ethical dilemmas within graduate students and within academic work. And also the fact that, the ethics doesn't just stop with the person that does or doesn't do the academic misconduct. It also falls on the person that discovers it, because ethically the right thing to do is to report things that are incorrect or falsified. And that can also be a very difficult thing to do. Let's take a second and paint with a broad brush in terms of data. If statistical outliers occur in a data set, how do you think they should be handled? And should it differ from academic discipline to discipline? Should it depend on anything, or should it just be the same for all cases? If anyone would like to mention some comments on that.
I'll give Outliers a shot. Again, I'm in business, I'm in humanities, and so we do some things that are different, but when I deal with outliers, and I think they're really important, it's a great way to know, do you know your data? And I think one of the first questions is just identifying, checking for outliers. I think the next question, and outliers happen, I mean, they do, it's a normal part of research and data collection. That's not a problem. And it can happen. It's what do you do with them and why. And so when you find them, I think the next question is, well, why do they occur? And I think this is kind of when you put on your detective hat and say, well, what could have happened? Dr. DeBramo found his ethics problem by essentially a data anomaly. I mean, the same thing's occurring, right? And so it's about investigating and explaining why. And then what I always say, regardless of someone's discipline, whatever the norms of that discipline are, there are some acceptable procedures for throwing out outliers, but I always say, if you want to cover yourself ethically, report it and report what you did and why you did it. And then the reader, the faculty member, the journal editor can make their own judgment, and you've been completely transparent. Here was my data, I identified these 5 outliers, here's why I think they occurred, and here's why we eliminated them from our data set for further research. And at least you've been completely forthright.
I would agree with that. I think what I had written down in response to that question was simply that they can be eliminated, but they can't be ignored. And when I've done data set analysis and things like that, I include them, and then I take them out. Or I may eliminate them and do an analysis, but I always refer to them in the publication, in the manuscript, that this occurred, this is where they were, and all that. Like I said, I think that there could be valid justification for eliminating them, but you never want to ignore them. You do want to provide that information so that anybody that's reviewing the manuscript has all the information that you have, rather than hiding it.
I think Dr. Pearson brought up a good point of determining why the outlier is present. I think that can reveal a lot of information as to why it's important, or if it was some sort of collection mistake, if you will. Switching gears to more of the social science research projects, what responsibilities do you think the researcher has to research participants after the research has ended?
Cut that. In various forms of research, we have human subjects. We have animal subjects at times, we have human subjects at times. We have guidance in terms of, when we do surveys, we cannot do that without IRB approval. We go through a process of making assurances to people that their data will remain confidential and things like that. There's an integrity issue there, absolutely, that you made a commitment to those people when they participate that you're going to do that. and that is important. It also feeds back in a lot of the data that we collect. We may want to go back to those people again. We have a responsibility to. And it may be that you got your dissertation, but if one story gets out that a researcher here at Mississippi State revealed confidential information to somebody, that will affect everybody who comes along after you wanting to do social science research, because people will not trust the next person no matter how many assurances we give. So you are responsible for the integrity of the institution, because if somebody reads a headline that says that this type of information or somebody has been abused in some manner in a research project, you will diminish the opportunities of everybody behind you, and that's why the institution is going to take it seriously. They have to take it seriously. And so when they make me do the paperwork and fill out the forms and give them assurances, I understand why that is the case.
I'll take a shot at this one. This is a question that we commonly refer to as post-trial obligations. What kind of obligations do you have to people who volunteered for your study once the study is over? And the answer I'm going to give you is going to come on two levels. The first level is going to be a simple compliance level, right? What kind of obligations do you have in order to be in compliance with federal regulations regarding human subjects research and guidelines regarding human subjects research? And these are surprisingly minimal. With regard to post-trial obligations, it's almost laughable to say that the only thing that is required of researchers is that they inform their subjects as to what benefits they will receive, if any, at the conclusion of the trial. Right? So there are no real post-trial obligations. There's only the obligation that you inform your subject as to whether there will be any obligations. So those are pretty minimal. And I present this as the level of compliance because I don't think that's the same as the level of ethical obligations that people have to one another. That's the level where you need to be in compliance with the law or the regulations that govern our institution and allow us to continue to get funding. I think that there are additional obligations that researchers have to subjects that go beyond this level of compliance. And the first, and this may sound surprising, but kind of follows up on what you said, researchers have an obligation to publish and disseminate the findings of the study. And this may sound surprising and weird to you, especially most of you who are graduate students, because you may be thinking, well, of course, right? You know, isn't that why I'm doing this, right? You know, I mean, who would do this and then not publish? And you would be surprised. You would be surprised if you talk to some of your more senior advisors as to how many years worth of data some of those people might have in their cabinets collecting dust, right? Some people are just slow to get papers out. Some people have motivational issues. Some people get sidetracked by more important projects, which may be other research programs, perhaps service or teaching projects. And papers sometimes sit unwritten for a really long time. And I think that's a violation of the post-trial obligation. I think that if somebody volunteers for your study, they are in partnership with you to get this question answered, right? They are agreeing with you that this question is important enough that it needs an answer. And so researchers have an obligation to get that out. I have other things to say, but they're not as important as that.
I think those are both very good points in terms of what we should use in order to be compliant with what we have to be, and then go that extra mile and do the right thing versus just doing what you have to do. What criteria should be used to determine authorship on a manuscript in preparation for submission or publication? Because I've often heard graduate students kind of debating on how much did my major professor help me with this? Does their name go first or second? And should they go on at all? Those types of questions. What are some thoughts on that?
I'll take a stab at this one first. I love it that you presented it that way, right? How much did my major professor help me with this manuscript? Because in that case, it's clear that the graduate student is going to get authorship on the manuscript, and they're trying to figure out who else to include, because so many times, by the time it gets to my desk, it's the other way around, right? It's that, you know, my major professor has this paper going out. I think I contributed a lot to it, and I think I deserve authorship on it, but at this point, it doesn't look like I'm going to get it, right? So I like to think of it in your way. But it happens both ways. My thought on this, and I'm cheating a little bit, I can see your notes too, and I think we agree. My thought on this is after the paper is written is the wrong time to be having this discussion. Right? After the paper is written is the wrong time to determine who gets to be an author on a paper. The right time to do it is in advance. Really at the time that you are conceiving the paper, and that roles and responsibilities should be divided and assigned with an eye for authorship, right? That is, they should be divided and assigned so that by the roles and responsibilities, it will be obvious who gets to be an author on a paper, and that needs to happen in advance. And I also think that, you know, so here I'm looking at it from my direction, you know, does the graduate student get to be an author? I think that major professors as mentors have an obligation to determine roles and responsibilities in such a way that their students can actually earn authorship on the papers that come out of the lab.
I think that discussing in advance is absolutely critical, but also revisiting that topic as the project goes along. You know, many research projects are multi-year projects, so having a discussion on the front end of who the team members are and what roles they play and what's a significant contribution versus a minor contribution. So maybe someone's acknowledged in the paper but not listed as an author. But revisiting that, because as we know, people come and go in and out of the lab. The project morphs and changes as it goes along because we realize, well, this part we were working on isn't going to work out. Let's abandon that and focus on this part of the project. And so revisiting that along the way and not being afraid as a graduate student to address that with a faculty member on the front end. And also on many of our projects being interdisciplinary, that's really crucial because the different cultures in the different disciplines, there may be unsaid expectations about, well, how much is the data important versus the algorithms that were developed to analyze the data, or the people who did the field work versus the people who were in the lab. And so different disciplines have different cultures, so having that conversation on the front end. But for me, it's about contribution and not status. So the ordering of the authors should be based on contribution, technical, scientific, creative, not on the status that that person holds. That's a good litmus test for me.
I would concur with that. And the project will, tell you a quick story. We had a master's student that I supervised, finished the thesis, we wrote a journal article out of it. The student went away to get his PhD. We worked with it while he was in grad school. He was busy. I had a postdoc that helped us get the journal article. We revised and resubmit and so forth. Then the grad student finished his PhD at another institution. We hired him back. The paper still wasn't accepted. So the first week back, I walk in and say, finish these revisions. You can still be the first author on your thesis. One thing I will say, I didn't think I had, in our research seminar, I didn't think I had to say this, but I've had a few experiences about this now. One of the things that you might not know that I will tell you is don't ever put somebody's name on a paper that they didn't know it.
Oh.
I have had that happen to me twice, and that is absolutely unacceptable. In both instances, the individual that did it thought they were doing me a favor. And it led to a very serious conversation. So that, you know, if you think that you're being wise in doing that, don't. Okay, the advice that you've been given, discuss it up front is always, and that's not just journal articles, that a paper at a conference, anything you do that has authorship, have that discussion.
I just going to echo what we started off by saying simply is that these things should be done in advance. And talking to graduate students in my department, I found that many of them had never had a conversation with their major professor about authorship and research that they're conducting. And a sign of a trait of a very good mentor is an individual who sits down with a graduate student, just one of the traits, and basically spells out expectations and spells out consequences. I gave my graduate students, I gave my master's graduate students in particular the opportunity to be first author on a research project that we were collaborating with, well, up to a certain point. That is, if you hadn't written it within a certain period of time, then you're going to become a second author. I've got to write this up. I have obligations, not only, let's say, to my promotion and tenure, but I have obligations to the graduate agency. So I think it's very, very important. If you have a good mentor, that individual, he or she, sitting down with you as a major professor and discussing expectations and consequences. And one of the other things that I think is very important nowadays, and things have changed since I was a graduate student, just due to the nature of science and research now, it's very interdisciplinary. And you've got a lot of people from different facets of research or disciplines that are working with you. If you go back and look at some of the early literature, there's only one author. But now things have changed, like I said, due to the nature of science and research. And so, again, up front, dealing with these people and deciding the type of research I do in aquaculture is production type research, but I have to work with economists, I have to work with engineers, I have to work with food processing people. They're all involved in the project one way or another. And so it becomes very, very important as to their contribution, whether or not they're included, and the level of contribution. So, interdisciplinary research is here and will always be here.
I think Dean DeBramo brought up a good point in terms of often graduate student research is highly useful for professors in various different ways, including ways of funding and different research that the professor might be doing as well that could collaborate.
Thomas, before you move on, can I
Oh, yes.
say one more thing? And this is to follow up on Dr. Rose's point where she said that she thinks it's contribution, not status, that determines authorship. Exactly right. But I want to make it clear that this, that whether it's contribution or status, should not be at the discretion of your advisor, right? That's actually no longer at the discretion of anybody. What you might not know is that most of the journals actually have authorship guidelines. And you may not see these, right? You know, they're not usually right up front. You have to go looking for them in their bylaws and their policies. And most of them have authorship guidelines. And if you're submitting an article to that journal, you need to make sure that the order in which you're listing your authors, who you're including and who you're excluding, conforms with their policy. And sometimes they don't explicitly state their authorship guidelines, but they state that they are members of a bigger group. And the bigger group will have authorship guidelines, oftentimes very explicit. So that's important to know and understand, especially when you're doing interdisciplinary work.
I think it's important to know that there's always somewhere you can go and look for guidelines for a conference you're submitting to or a certain type of research that you're doing. For the professional organizations that are available, there's always the opportunity to go and look for those guidelines that group expects everyone that is a part of that group or submits information to that group to uphold to. Back to Dean DeBramo's point about the importance of graduate research in terms of professors for various reasons, how are students protected from coercion or harassment by tenure-track faculty whose research productivity determines their prospect for tenure?
I think one of the great aspects of a lot of graduate education is there's a lot of things that are done by committee. Not everything, but a lot of things are, that we have a program study committee, we have a dissertation committee. So even though you may have one strong individual in a leadership role, it's not one individual alone that determines the path. So I think the nature of graduate education does have some degree of protection built in through that community of scholars. It's not perfect, but there is some degree.
Anyone might have examples of ways that you've seen other people ensure that this doesn't happen, or ways that things that you can do to make sure it doesn't happen?
Well, I think that graduate students should be aware of the fact that there are policies here at the university that really protect them from this harassment policy. That'll probably go through human resource management. But there's also a new policy that is in the process of being changed into an academic operating policy, AOP, which has to do with graduate student grievances. And grievances that may involve, if you will, coercion, or a situation where there is incredible demands put on the graduate student above and beyond what would be normal, expected, things like that. So I'm glad that we've done it. It's been about 3 years in the making, but Mississippi State University will have a graduate student grievance policy that will be an AOP. It's kind of similar to what we have for undergraduates. And I think it's important because, again, not all mentors would be what you would call good leaders. And I should say that not all major professors would be considered to be good mentors. And certainly graduate students here are here to learn. Graduate students are here to work hard, but also there can be abuses. We see those abuses here in the graduate school. We're hoping that students will move forward and talk about those with the proper individuals, rather than to just let them go, or just out of fear, apprehension, not go ahead, like I said, go ahead and deal with them in a proper way.
I guess just one comment, and that is that the university takes these issues seriously. And you may be in a very awkward position in general. I would say that if you are not comfortable talking to a particular individual, you go one step above them. And if you have to, you keep going up. Hopefully it can be resolved at the lowest possible level. But and do understand, if you level an accusation at somebody that you think they have committed academic fraud or abuse, this is a serious thing and it will be taken seriously. And so I think, as Lori mentioned, you sit there and thought about it for a week. What should you do? But ultimately, you've got to do the right thing.
For example, if you have an assistantship, whether it be graduate research or graduate teaching assistantship or even service assistantship, you do have a commitment to a professor. You do have a commitment to some other type of entity on campus, service entity on campus, to provide 20 hours of work. Okay? Now, under your own volition, if you want to work more than 20 hours on that, you can. But under coercion, when you're told that no, it's not just 20 hours a week, it's 30 or 35 or 40, then again, this is wrong. This is a violation of policy. You shouldn't sit there and take it. I mean, we've had situations in the graduate school where students come in and say that they're working 50 hours a week. Now, that's wrong. That's a violation of the policy. And in some cases, if it's an international student, I see some international students here, it's a major violation of policy, because no graduate student, international graduate student, is allowed to work more than 20 hours. This is a federal law. And then, and this is the people laughing, okay, this is under coercion.
Right.
Okay, be careful. Okay. And it's a violation of federal law, which means that in essence, all the federal grants that have come to the university could be in jeopardy. Very, very serious.
I want to follow up on that, but, you know, because I have in my office as Associate Dean for Research and Grad Studies in Engineering, I will have students come to me sometimes with this issue, and when I sit with them, sometimes, not always, but fortunately most of the time, when we sit and really tease out what were they working on during those 40 or 50 hours, it turned out that about 20 of them really were for the research assistantship. The other 20 was for their thesis or their dissertation. It wasn't the work for pay, you know, for the assistantship. And so I think that's a gray area that students can get caught in. And so, you know, unfortunately, that's not always the case. But to be thinking about when you're working on a project or when you're working towards something as a graduate student, because we're on an RA, or it doesn't mean everything we're doing in that lab is that RA application. A lot of times it's the extra work that needs to be done to tidy off the thesis or the dissertation. It's not the exact part of the project that the funding agency is wanting done, and that's work for pay.
I'd like to follow up on something Dr. Pearson said. The other panelists have done a really good job of making sure that the graduate students know there is a vertical chain of command that you can go through if you've got an issue that you think needs to be addressed, right? And if you have an issue with your major professor, you can obviously go to the department head of your unit. You can go if your college has an associate dean for graduate studies. You could go see Dr. Caramo, and it might even go higher than that if it needs to, right? There is a vertical chain of command, but what Dr. Pearson was implying is that there's also a lateral option, a lateral or a horizontal option instead of a vertical, right? And you may be assigned to a major professor, you may be working in only one lab, but hopefully you are at least on friendly terms with other professors in your department. And you should feel that their door is always open, right? That there's always other people to talk to. And if for some reason you're not on friendly terms with other professors in the department, I see Katie Eccles in the audience here. She just did a great job in writing a new policy. This went through at the beginning of this year to make available to you a research ethics consultation. And this is something that's completely anonymous, right? That completely bypasses the vertical chain of command and completely bypasses formally filing a grievance, right? And as a graduate student, you are entitled to a research ethics consultation if there's anything that you think is concerning about your situation. And that's handled completely anonymously without any record. And that's just to sit down and help you sort it out and give you good advice, perhaps at the same kind of conversation that you would have had if you had ended up in Dr. Bruce's office. You know, well, let's sit down and let's talk about it, right? Let's see what's going on, and just a second set of ears to help you understand whether this is actually a problem or whether it's a misunderstanding, and then give you advice on how to proceed.
That's very good advice by Dr. Phillips. But I want to make a point too that within the bulletin of the graduate school, there is a grievance policy, and that grievance policy details really the vertical chain of command in terms of making a grievance and following through on it. So that is available. It's in the bulletin.
I think what a lot of the panelists hit on is communication. You know, communication with your major professor, communication with the person that you feel is asking you to do more than you feel like you should, and also communicating with people, other people within the area, other professors, like Dr. Phillips mentioned. Switching gears just a little bit, we've spoken a lot about ethics in terms of data and in terms of research. I want to talk about a case study, and I want to make sure I give reference to where we retrieved it from. We got it from the APS Task Force on Ethics Education, and it says, you're a faculty mentor for a graduate student in your department. The student's taking classes in another department that require written essays. The student asks you to read his essay before he submits it. You routinely Google his work and discover that large parts have been lifted verbatim from the web with no quotation marks or citations. How do you handle the situation, and what should be the penalty for this obvious incident of misconduct?
I'll take a stab. I actually think that, that as a logistical matter, this is not academic misconduct because the paper has not yet been submitted, right? It's still in draft form. The graduate student has asked the mentor to review a draft. So I don't think it technically counts as an incidence of academic misconduct. And even if someone tried to file paperwork, if I were on that jury, I probably would not determine it to be academic misconduct. But what it is a big red flag, right? A big red flag for the advisor that shows that the student either doesn't understand what plagiarism is and how to properly write papers, or understands but doesn't understand the importance of avoiding it. And this is a big problem that the advisor needs to address. So I would, in a case like this, I would love to see the advisor call the student into his office and say, look, we need to talk about this. Large sections of what you've written are lifted from the internet, and that's inappropriate. And this is a problem. This is not going to go well for you, right? Because either you're going to get caught while you're a student, or even worse, you're going to get caught once you get out, right? If you get caught while you're a student, you may be able to recover. If you get caught once you get out, your career is over, right? This isn't going to go well for you, and it isn't going to go well for me, right? You know, you are my graduate students. You're coming out of here with my name on your CV, right? I'm the one who's going to be writing letters of recommendation for you, right? If I'm worried that you're going to do stuff like this, I can't write a good, honest letter, right? And in most disciplines, there is collaborative work that comes from an advisor-student relationship. And the advisor needs to know that if there is any plagiarism in that work, even if he didn't commit it, even if it was on the graduate students, and once his name goes onto that publication, he is equally responsible for it, right? So this advisor needs to have a frank conversation with his students, and I would also like to see the advisor require the student to take additional training in research ethics as a condition for their continued relationship, right? So this might be the advisor gets in touch with James Orr, who runs our student honor code, and says, can you get one of my students into the class that students have to take when they get caught violating the honor code, right? You know, and the graduate student's going to hate it, but that's tough, right? You know, the student needs to learn not only that this is not okay, but the student needs to learn why it's not okay, so that it won't happen again.
I'll follow up on that. That's all very good advice. I think this is the most rampant problem we have today. I think it's also the easiest thing to get caught. You're not going to get away with plagiarism today. Our journals care enormously. This is their profit model. They do not like it when somebody infringes on a copyright. They will go after people. Okay? The disciplines care enormously about this because at the end of the day, what is my contribution to science? It's my ideas. It's my work. You claim my work as your work, you just robbed me. And to build our careers as a scientist, as you build your career as a scientist, you don't want somebody else claiming your work as their own. It's part of the norms, it's part of the reputation, part of it. Let me ask you all a question. Can you plagiarize yourself? Can you? Yes? No?
Yes.
Yes. You can even plagiarize yourself. Once you sign that copyright release form, you are plagiarizing even if those are words that you wrote. when you try to use them again in the next paper. So you have, my sense is that kind of the norms across different countries, we have students from all over the world here, are different. But while you have got to learn the rules by which we're playing here, and it can be serious. And once it can have consequences, and it can be a real problem. And so we talk to our grad students all the time about this, and it is a very serious issue. Maybe people don't get it, but we've got to keep telling you that. This is my great frustration today. And we're to the point, we're not going to take a thesis or dissertation unless we run it through Turnitin.com. And if we find one paragraph, it's going to be serious. So I hope you all will pay attention to that.
Science only advances through trust. And plagiarism is an example, and the other examples of severe breach of trust. And as Dr. Coble was saying, journalists have a definite interest in this. And again, we're talking about consequences. It's not worth it. What can happen simply is a journal can ban you for life from publishing it. It's happened. I've seen it. If you're interested in your career, this is a very, very important journal, because you may not be in a journal related to your particular discipline. It could cause a real problem in terms of you advancing in your career. You may no longer publish for 10 years of your life. So journals take this very, very seriously, and the consequences of this are major.
Okay. Real quickly, in about 2 minutes, you can give us your final closing remarks on ethics and research and ethics within academics, and also proactive ways to train students to assure that they are aware of expectations and ethical guidelines. It's a lot to do in a short time.
I would say ignorance might be a reason, but it's not a good excuse. I mean, it doesn't, so if someone is violating, has ethical misconduct, saying they didn't know doesn't get them very far. And so it's on the researchers, it's their responsibility to know what the appropriate conduct is and to abide by it.
I think the biggest danger is deviating from common morality. And there's two ways in which I often see this happening. One is when students blindly follow their advisors, their mentors, and the people they work under, right? And that is a lot of people role model bad behavior, right? And sometimes they will, they'll even say, do as I say, not as I do. Sometimes they won't even recognize the disparity between the two. But a lot of people role model behavior that's not going to be good for you to follow, right? But there's a tendency to go ahead and follow it. There's a tendency to think, well, this is how it's done, right? And what we call this is deviating from common morality and assuming game rules, right? And what happens here, and you'll probably, once you understand the difference, start to recognize this in other aspects of your life, right? Sometimes you step into a situation, and it may shock you at first, or it may take a while to shock you, and then you come to realize, well, this is just how the game is played, right? Everyone else is playing it this way, everyone else expects me to play it this way, and so even though it didn't make sense to me in the beginning, and even though on some level I still think it's kind of wrong, this is how the game is played, and so this is how I need to play it. And that's the biggest danger, because that's when you see people who are otherwise good people, who otherwise have good common sense, doing some horrendous things and getting caught and ruining their careers. because they just sort of follow blindly into this game-based morality without ever pausing to think, is this really what I should be doing?
One of the great things I think we all share in common is we must love our discipline and we must love learning, or we wouldn't be here, right? I mean, we wouldn't be. I mean, I think it's the great common denominator in graduate studies, and so I think there's a very pure place in all of us that believe in the advancement and the ideas of science and want to advance it. And there's some basic principles to be able to do that. You have to have great ideas. They have to be original ideas, and I think we have to be very transparent in communicating how we put forth those ideas, whether it's explaining our outlier analysis or our analysis technique that we used. And it's not saying I necessarily did it absolutely the best way, but as long as I'm saying here is exactly what I did, my colleagues can certainly evaluate it and draw their own conclusions about, was that a worthy advancement of a new idea in science, and we've all been transparent.
I want to follow up on all these comments. You know, I tell my graduates that you get to do research. There are a lot of things that you could do in life that are a lot less fun than discovery of new information and new knowledge. Your job as a graduate student is to find the frontier of your discipline and move it. Not a long ways, but a little bit, okay? That's all we ask of you, move that frontier a little bit. But if you go finish your dissertation and you have fraudulently, you've cooked the data, whatever you've done, and if people accept that as new knowledge, and then we find out that we can't replicate your study, that everybody else gets a different answer, then we just lost and wasted a bunch of time. And so in science, we consider this really, really important because it's a part of the process of us moving forward into new knowledge. And that's why we have these norms. And that's why we're so adamant about them. But you have the opportunity to be a part of something that is really fun. And I hope you, it is fun to discover new knowledge, but it's not a game to build a veto. That's not what we're about. We're about new knowledge.
I guess the last thing I would say is that these breaches of trust, which is really ethical violations, are something that will not be tolerated. You need to be aware of that. As a result, it's not worth it, whatever the motivation might be. And I guess the final thing that I'd like to say is ethics education is a dynamic process. You need to take time to talk about ethics principles with your peers, with your fellow graduate students, also with your major professor or professors in your department. It's very, very important. An ongoing, as I say, dynamic dialogue about ethics is very, very important. Even take Dr. Phillips' course, which I've tried to get a lot of graduate students to take. Again, it's not a static thing. It's not that something you learn and then walk away from. It's a very, very dynamic process.
Thank you. I think the panel has done an excellent job today discussing some of the key points in ethics and research conduct within academics. There's a lot that we didn't even get to today. I mean, we could spend the whole afternoon talking about social media and different ways of surveying and lots of different things. But we want to thank you for coming. We want to thank the office, the Honor Code office, for putting this week together, Integrity Week. We're glad to be a part of it. And thank you for Dr. Coates for putting a lot of this together. And let's give a thanks to our panel.